So thanks everyone for coming to our EdRes Educational Research Seminar. We're really happy to have Rita and Asadullah here. So Rita Hordósy and Asad Lashari, who are going to be talking about what is sociological research, exploring Norwegian, Hungarian and English stuff, and student views and curriculum documents. So I'm duty-bound to say that the seminar is being live-streamed for postgraduate researchers, staff, and other interested folks. People who are here can ask questions at the end of the presentation or via the chat box. So I'll keep an eye out, and you can raise digital or manual hands later on. If you're not presenting, could you mute yourself and switch off your camera? That would be great. So without further ado, Rita and Asadullah, the floor is yours. And thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having us. It will be lovely to talk to you about this research that myself, Betul Yasdiman and Asad were doing in the past couple of years. So, Asad, would you mind introducing yourself for just to say who you are?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us here. My name is Asadullah Lashari. I recently completed my doctoral degree from University of Nottingham. It's been just 4 months, barely, that I got my degree from University of Nottingham. And I had this privilege to work with Dr. Rita on this project in the very first year of my PhD. And since then, it has been a great opportunity to learn, because I was in my initial years. So it actually helped me a lot in my own understanding of the research as well. Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Rita. Yeah.
Thank you. So this project started in 2019, and it was basically my Nottingham Research Fellowship. So since then, when I started, since then I transitioned onto an assistant professorship at the University of Nottingham. I'll share my screen and do let me know if this actually works. Okay. Can you see that all right in terms of the slides?
Yep.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Very good. So unfortunately, fortunately for Betul, she can't be with us today because she's already on maternity leave and has been for the past couple of weeks. So we're really, really happy for her. She's still waiting for her second baby to arrive. But for obvious reasons, we didn't ask her to come and join us today. But Asad kindly agreed to still talk about this project that we've done a couple of years ago together and talk about the curriculum document specifically in this talk. So as I said, this has been a long research project that I've been leading on, and it has been, the aim was to explore sociology and specifically the research and teaching nexus in sociology departments in Norway, Hungary and England. And today I will focus on the student views and the curriculum documents, but I can talk a little bit about the staff views as well. I will explain why the student data is better in a lot of ways than the staff data. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I will explain why this is. But first, I will talk a little bit about the context, if I can go to the next slide. There we go. What's amazing to talk about this work at Lancaster, or colleagues at Lancaster, because quite a lot of the underpinnings to this research is actually deriving from the work of people who used to or still work at Lancaster. So as you can see here, I'm actually referring to Paul Ashwin, Monica McLean and Andrea Abbas's work on using the concept of powerful knowledge from Bernstein in terms of the pedagogical rights that disrupt inequalities. So this is where I kind of started from originally to start looking into this in more detail. And I focus on sociology departments, just as they have done in their previous research projects, to kind of follow on from those angles, and where they kind of compared UK-based institutions. My passion is in comparative research, and this is why this project is comparative in scope. I also draw on Margaret Archer's work on personal projects and the dedication towards a modus vivendi. And I've published before on this in terms of the transformative nature of higher education in general. And it's a previous project that I will refer to again to bring into this particular talk as well. Most recently with Betul and Jenny Norris, who was another PhD student who I worked with throughout this fellowship. We have used possible selves concept or theory to explore possible sociological selves, and we're hoping to publish something from this very soon. And of course, all of this is underpinned by notions of what sociology is, and I draw on Burawoy and Michael Burawoy's work on sociologies of vocation and public sociology more general. So again, as I said before, quite a lot of this work kind of interweaves some of the work of colleagues in Lancaster. So it's where I come from, where kind of the literature underpinning all of this has started me off, was the research and teaching nexus as a concept or as a research area. And quite a lot of that work has either fallen into these three categories. So quite a lot of the work initially started off with looking at associations between research and research outputs of staff and teaching evaluations. So that kind of interlink, that measurable link between the two. Quite a lot of the work in this research area links to or looks at student experiences as well as staff attitudes towards their different roles within universities, research as well as teaching. But there's a strand of the literature that also looks at differences in institutional types or disciplines as well as the systemic view. However, very often this link between research and teaching is treated quite unproblematically, despite the link's inherent political nature. And this is where Trollen and Wareham's work on the possible dysfunctions of the research and teaching nexus were quite important to when I started the project itself and worked on previously a couple of papers on this. It's important to think about this kind of political aspect to the link, to thinking about how research often becomes a marketing tool, as Marginson calls it, an aspect of brand power of universities, and a way to accumulate resources. Whereas from staff experiences, it's very often there is a lot of issues and discrepancies in how different roles are not compensated equally, quite frankly, and they're not all mutually beneficial, if that makes sense. I draw on, again, Tight's work on the research and teaching nexus. He's written recently a really good review paper on this, and it's kind of that sort of notion between these links. One of the papers that I've written with a colleague, Tom Clark, from a previous project that was a longitudinal piece of work, looked at the research and teaching nexus over time. And it was the project originally explored student experiences in the context of the higher fees. So we followed the 2013 cohort of undergraduate students at British University throughout their studies. So we looked at how they experienced the university in a lot of different angles from a lot of different views in phase one, so first year, second year, third year, but we also interviewed them in the fourth year. And it has been an amazing project, and I've published quite a few things from this. But one of the papers, we specifically focused on the research and teaching nexus and how students actually see the development of disciplinary knowledge, the relationship with researchers, and this sort of experience of what research is in their own practice. And what's interesting, and this is what I will refer back to later on, is how this changes from a really broad understanding of what research is or what disciplinary knowledge is towards a more selecting a specific and narrow understanding of what the discipline does and who you are within it, I guess. But also the relationship with the researchers on who does the research changes from a very distant kind of, I read these things in books, in research papers, to something a lot closer where I myself know researchers, or I am myself the researcher. And it's a really interesting process that not all students go through, but most of them get to that sort of phase two, if not the phase three. Very often the nature of independent learning is quite key, I guess, because in phase three, they are more likely to generate their own questions and start to discover the research areas for themselves. And this is what I will be referring to later on as well. So about the research project itself, this is an internationally comparative design. I had 3 case study countries that I hope to visit, but for some reason I couldn't actually do that in reality. So the case studies are Hungary, England, and Norway, and originally I hoped to have Germany as well. But in the context of COVID hitting in 2020, when in the spring I planned this data collection, it was almost impossible to get people to sign up, quite frankly. So I was quite happy with some of the data collection, especially on the student side. So I've got really good coverage of Norwegian and Hungarian student data, and relatively good data from English students. But the staff data has been quite problematic. The Hungarian case study was the first one I started to organize and started to schedule. Therefore, I've got really good coverage there for staff interviews. Norway was a bit worse because that was the second case study that I already started to organize when COVID hit. And the English case study was probably the worst one out of the 3, just because by the time I came to try and schedule interviews with people, for obvious reasons, the focus wasn't on my little research project. So therefore I kind of realized that it's probably worth moving on, and this is how I started to work with quite a lot of the PhD students, including Asad and Jenny, and quite a lot of other people. It has been an interesting way to kind of shift focus, I guess, in your research. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this group of people who had to do that because of COVID. But it has been quite beneficial from the perspective of having a chance to work with amazing researchers and having that sort of community, or building a community around this. As I said, we have used sociology students' interviews, academics' interviews that I will refer to, but I won't be quoting them. Asad will be talking about the institutional and curriculum documents, and we have elsewhere published some of the national student registration data. So as I said, the planned in-person data collection would have been March to June 2020. Most of the colleagues who agreed to be interviewed were actually willing to be interviewed online as well, which is really, really lovely. And the project gained ethical approval from the University of Nottingham. So I'm going to give the floor to Asad to talk about the curriculum documents now. Let me know when I need to click for the next bit of the slide.
Sure. Thank you, Rita. So we basically analyzed and evaluated curriculum documents of these three countries and selected universities among them, and we focused on on different aspects, which theoretical courses are being offered in this program of BA/BSc sociology, undergraduate sociology programs, which kind of research methods are being focused in this particular degree, and what kind of other subjects, thematic sociologies, and also we focused on some of the other things which are being offered in the course, such as the semester abroad, field work, and so on and so forth. So basically, we evaluated these 3 things in this curriculum documents, in which we focused on which kind of theoretical subjects, theories are being taught, which kind of research methods are focused, and the other thematic sociology subjects. You can change, Rita.
Is that all right?
Yes, perfect. So you can see here the research method courses and the other specialism subjects. So research methods, they are normally taught in the degree, in the first year and second year. This is what we see in most of these, among all these 3 countries. In UK, generic social science research methods, no particular focus. There were only subjects which related to the research methods in general, not focusing any particular research method. But in Hungary, we saw that quantitative states and maths and some softwares related subjects were offered in this degree. Apart from that, specialism in UK, you can see either other social science disciplines or quantitative methods. In Norway and Hungary, mostly thematic sociology subjects were dominant in this degree program. So you can see that in UK, you can see it's a more broad and generic subjects were offered. In Norway and Hungary. They were mostly related to the different themes of sociology, gender sociology, the other sociological subjects were offered. So I have this in front of me, the document, which we haven't basically included here. The subjects in Hungary, which focused on specializations, they were related to regional settlement, development, gender sociology, media sociology, organization, innovation, leadership. So these were some of the subjects were offered in specialization in Hungary. In Norway, again, thematic sociology was the focus, in which cultural sociology, media and society, politics of environment, theories and models in political economy, separation of society and exclusion, work, education, welfare policy. So these were the specialist subjects which were being offered in Norway universities. Coming towards UK universities, we had different universities, different focus was there in this program. Such as in University of Warwick, we had BA Sociology in Technologies and Markets, BA Sociology in Race and Global Politics. In Bristol University, we had the Sociology with Quantitative Research Methods, BA Sociology with Study Abroad. So these kind of subjects were offered in these three countries. So yes, over to you, Rita.
Thank you. That was really, really helpful. So I will now go to the interview data specifically from students. So this is where we're really missing Betul, because this is, I think this kind of quadrant was her conceptualization of the research data. And I think she contributed immensely to kind of think about this with me together. How to actually present the data and how to actually kind of refocus on some of these aspects that the research and teaching nexus literature does talk about, but also we're kind of bringing that together with some of the other kind of theoretical and conceptual work that I actually mentioned before. So first, I'm going to focus on this idea that just knowing about academics, research, and life is broadly motivating to students, but also kind of talking about the importance of personal relationships that most students actually mention. So here is an extract from Andreas from Norway, where he's actually talking about his experience of hearing about the possibilities of what sociology can be for, and how it actually can translate into the working life and working environment, and how this actually, knowing about what others do, is quite motivating for, his own future work, or thinking about his own future work. I'll leave you a moment. So the next student, Blanca from Hungary, was talking about her experiences of hearing about a lecturer's work and kind of research outside the curriculum. And it was interesting how she suggested that teaching something that wasn't your research specialism probably wasn't what people do. And I think it's not that simple, of course, because sometimes we do have to pick up things that we haven't researched necessarily. And it is a more complex relationship from a staff perspective. But for her, she suggested that, of course, you can teach something that you haven't actually researched, but it's much more difficult, or they won't be up to date in relation to the given topic. So it's quite interesting how she's relating the importance of being able to talk about this authentically and being able to convey the importance of it, and knowing something from your research experience as well. So she again kind of talked about how important it was that instructors do talk about their own research, and they generally introduce it at the start of the courses. But then the next couple of extracts will actually focus on how that actually happens. So extracurricular activities are interesting because it came up in all of the cases, but it was particularly strong in Hungary, where students seem to be involved with quite a lot of the research that staff do, both within and slightly outside of the institution. So they do sociological research in some of these guys, either within their universities or related to a research organization outside. And this has been really, really important in relation to kind of thinking about their own possible sociological futures. For example, Bernard in Norway talked about how he's been sort of the mentee, the research assistant for a particular academic, and that particular academic had a huge impact on his career and how he was actually approaching his own research, but also in terms of showing him the ropes. And I think this is really, really key. It's kind of getting the knowledge not just about how research happens, but the kind of environment and the structures, the processes around research. You know, how do you get funding? How do you get published? How do you actually build a research team? How do you actually go about thinking about your next project? You know, those networks that actually are key to getting your work out there. And I think this is what Bernard kind of referred to, that it was really important for him to get to know this person throughout his BA, then leading on to a master's, then leading on to actually entering a PhD. So then Laurent talked about the importance of those personal relationships in a bit more detail in the context of an extracurricular research project he was involved with. And he said that the two lecturers that, you know, led on a small research project in a settlement, that they actually stayed over and they kind of interviewed people there. Both of them were so direct. That's how we saw them function as people. And we did research in the process. So this is a really, really interesting kind of light on being seen as real as an academic, not just a teacher or not just a person who kind of provides information. It is the processes, the understanding of how they are and how they think and how they work as a human in their research itself. And I think Laurent kind of linked this experience to a very, very university doesn't have to be an alienating thing. It can be something that you find motivation and focus through. And he kind of juxtaposed this with some of the quantitative data analysis courses that he wasn't that fond of. So the third area that I think Betul's analysis showed very importantly is focusing on the goods of sociology, whether that's methods or theories or concepts, and generally the thinking sociologically. Seeing sociology as an applicable discipline was quite a discussion with a lot of staff members in all of these countries, where notions of why do people actually come to sociology and why do they stay or drop out were quite important and discussed a lot. Just because I think it's very often in the context of kind of employability and what do you get out of your discipline, what is the kind of employability outcomes and where do you go from it are really, really key and are a topic of discussion. So in this context, Leonore talked about her experiences of having gained analytical skills that then she realizes she could actually use it. She wanted to use those skills later on, and she wants to actually find an area where this is an important aspect, marrying it up with her original interest in working in youth and social support. So she's kind of linking up that what she gained as a good of sociology, as a kind of method skill, with what she wants to do later on, and kind of that potential sociological self who's able to employ these skills at a later stage. Similarly, Annie talked about her kind of what she gained through sociology, both in terms of the kind of thematic sociologies, understanding the social world in a bit more detail, but also thinking about those theories, concepts, to explain the social world to others, to have a bit more of a basis for your opinion rather than just saying, if this is my opinion because it's my opinion. So it's kind of, she says it's important to have this particular outlook on certain things. For instance, she brings the example of crime being a social construct and says, I wouldn't even have thought about that because the media doesn't ever say that. Yes. So you are never going to think that unless someone actually sparks that idea in your mind. So it was really interesting to see how this thinking sociologically about the social world and the world around you was really, really key to understanding how they can then function as future professionals in their areas, but also as citizens of a society that they live in. So then the fourth area, the sort of personal projects that can develop before, change and transform throughout, and become sort of a modus vivendi, as Margaret Archer puts it. Noemi talked about how she realized what she wanted to do for her capstone project through one of these extracurricular activities that she did outside of university, kind of working with others and being taken seriously in the team, even though she felt like she was quite junior as a BA student. She was, listened to and incorporated into that research project, and she really appreciated that experience. And she wants to do a similar project in the environment where she was from, in a small town, and wants to select villages from the surrounding area to actually explore similar issues in her capstone project. But it also showed her what the process of research, and she was actually later on in the interview talking about how she now is thinking about doing a master's and potentially going on to doing a PhD later on. So to summarize, and this is where I'm kind of referring back to our previous work with Tom Clark on the research and teaching nexus longitudinally. These are the sort of constraints on development that we discussed before in that paper, but I think are referring to some of the work here as well. So there is an issue over time with diminishing interest in the nature and utility of research. Not all students will understand why they have to do this sort of capstone project that is research-based. It's dependent on the kind of changing career goals. They might not be wanting to go down the route. They might just want to take some of those skills and the goods of sociology and leave and do nothing to do with necessarily research. There's often a discussion around insufficient scaffolding around research and teaching, whether they have the competence and the kind of connections to staff, how to actually build a research project and planning and organizing it all. There is a perceived distance, and I think some of this in the interviews came out a little bit, especially at the start of degrees where there's big lectures often, less seminar teaching, less kind of personal connection to academic staff. And there's an issue with not seeing that sort of enthusiasm of other researchers or researchers themselves to then being able to imagine yourself as a sociological, in your possible sociological future. And of course, there are issues around participation in higher education, class-related issues, who can afford to go and do masters, who can afford to do unpaid internships and extracurricular activities. There are issues around who is involved in those activities and in those opportunities that are offered. So who is the enthusiastic middle-class student who will know about these, how to actually gain those. And I think especially in the Hungarian case, that came up in some of the discussions with staff, especially who is involved and who actually gets those opportunities is a question. So I think we got to the end, so we'll take a couple of questions on the project itself, and then both Asad and myself, and we will convey some of the suggestions from Betul as well to you on PhD, career planning, what we think might be important. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just quickly looking for my clap button. Where is it? There it is. So, Asad, Rita, thanks a lot for that. You covered a lot of ground. Lots of super interesting things. So the floor is open. So any questions at this point from attendees? Either put them in the chat or raise a digital or actual hand and let me know.
I will stop sharing and then reshare the slides. Is that okay? Because I can't,
Sure,
I
of
can
course.
only see you in like a tiny.
It's probably
Yeah.
best, to be honest, but
Oh, I think there is some in the chat. Oh yeah, that's just comments. Sorry. Hello, everyone.
I was going to ask a quick question. That kind of the relationship between sociological goods, who academics are as people, personal projects, and extracurricular, how do they kind of potentially join together or not join together? I mean, there's some people who, for whom all of those things, they really become kind of embedded and changed. I know there's that work before that you referenced that Paul has done of how people kind of change how they see the world through sociology, and then that does or doesn't change how they go about stuff, or Esther Muddyman's work around instrumentalism in different disciplines, for example.
Yeah.
How do those four different things relate to one another? Is there kind of like an optimum approach that where all of those things come through really strongly in a really positive way?
Yes, what's interesting is that in the staff data, it has been, because obviously staff will think, you know, what are the issues around participation? What are the issues around thinking about employability? What are the issues around, you know, curriculum and compliance and all those things around the issues that they face to try and change things. The student data was actually really positive in all honesty, but I think there's an issue with recruitment because very often the disgruntled students might not want to talk about their experiences per se. I think what I haven't got to yet, and I'm using all these talks to actually try and work out what we're going to write in that particular section of the paper in terms of the discussions, is precisely this: how does this all interlink? How does this all actually make a student experience that is potentially transformative for the students? So I'm looking for any suggestions that you have based on what I just talked about.
Yeah, that point about self-selection. I mean, the people who aren't interested in sociology are the ones who don't volunteer, right? As in, for whatever reason. I mean, there are lots of reasons. As we've talked about before, recruiting students to projects should be really easy because they're a captive audience, but somehow it's almost invariably brutally difficult, regardless of what you do. Anne-Marie, you've visibilized yourself. Is that the right word?
I have, as if by magic. I wasn't sure actually whether during our conversations post presentation, whether that was what we needed to do, because I sort of different things. Anyway, just to say thank you very much indeed, Rita and Asad. It was very, very interesting. And I think perhaps, so my name's Anne-Marie and I have several roles within the university. And I suppose perhaps picking on Richard's point about how these four things interconnect, I wondered if there was any sort of any evidence within the sort of research and findings that you felt that actually because of people's roles or positions or as they moved through, that actually that caused or meant that they were going to need to perhaps play out some of these things in different sorts of ways because of the presumptions or the assumptions that people were making upon them. And I suppose I'm thinking a little bit personally in the sense of having different roles and reflecting on my own background, how there will be different situations where some of these factors do and don't come into play.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'd be interested to just hear if there was anything.
I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I think that this might actually be the way to think about it in terms of what is actually spotlighted for different students at different stages. So certainly that sort of knowing about researchers' research is the start. Is this is where kind of it all starts from. Do I hear anything that is captivating my experience, my interests, and do I actually hear anything that kind of resonates with me? To think, you know, that could be me. But then the next steps are the sort of gaining the goods of sociology to start seeing this as a potential career path. You know, I can be that person who uses these skills, and I can be this person who sort of uses these concepts or theories and applies them in their research or in the working life. Then to link that to the sort of extracurricular activities as a potential space where those those personal connections start to develop with academics who are sociologists or who are social scientists. In a space where I am the researcher already, you use some of these things that I learned, and that's when we got to get to the personal projects. Thank you. We just wrote the discussion chapter.
Yeah.
Discussion section. Yeah, I think that should work as a way to understand it. So basically getting to the personal project and understanding sociology as a thing that I do, and a thing that a person that I am, isn't necessarily where everyone gets to, but it's where hopefully we're trying to help them to get to.
And I suppose there's also those moments where somebody is beginning to test out those things in terms of perhaps drawing upon ideas, embedding them in their everyday lives, which is again influencing how others will then perceive them. I won't hog the floor, but I might come back later.
That's really helpful. Thank you. That was
really
really helpful 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Can I also ask another, well, it's probably not a quick question, another question about the comparative dimension, because you've looked at 4 different, yes, you've got small samples and we can, you know, say all about the kind of the generalizability and blah, 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 that stuff, but actually what you've got is rich data. So is there anything that you can see which connects to the literature about how the different education systems, in inverted commas, function in terms of how they work, you know, distance between staff and students, for example, or the nature of teaching relationships and those kinds of things? Because as, well, you and I have talked about for years, higher education is the same and different in all sorts of different countries. And then it's a question of understanding how those countries, how their university cultures function or malfunction, and how you then start to see through your staff or students, participants' eyes, how do they see Hungarian HE, and how does that compare through their eyes with Norwegian? And with, you know, you've got different fees, you've got all sorts.
Yeah, so I think one of the key differences is in the staff experiences, because I was genuinely surprised how a lot of the themes that came up in student interviews was broadly similar. So these kind of issues are kind of cropping up in all the interviews, and it was kind of surprising how variability and comparability was not. I was surprised how little difference I could find in a way. I know that the extracurricular activities was a lot more mentioned in Hungary, and that's partly because of the nature of funding. So there's a lot of smaller research projects that people actually do in their spare. Well, I'll explain why. Okay, because that's a particular funding issue. So I think the dedication, sort of modus vivendi as a sociologist, wasn't as strong in England as in some of the Norwegian and the Hungarian data, and I'm not quite sure why that is yet. I need to kind of work with the data a little bit more to actually understand. But I think it partly is down to the fact as well that the English interviews, I didn't actually talk to as many PhD students and master students as I have in Norway and in Hungary, or late stage students, just because I was aiming to recruit 3rd-year students, and in some cases, especially in England, I actually ended up with 1st and 2nd-year students as well, just because of the nature of how I recruited through gatekeepers. But I think the Hungarian case is quite interesting, and I wrote a Hungarian language paper on this specifically in relation to funding. There's a major issue with how the Hungarian AG is funded, because very often staff are mandated to deliver certain hours of teaching. And it means that their research time is very, very limited if they're academics working full-time in a university or at a university. Now, that has actually compounded with the issue of 2nd jobs and 3rd jobs and 5th jobs. Very often people have a position in a university and a position in a research organization, which makes it really, really tricky to kind of marry up those timelines and try and actually do work in between. You know, people actually said to me how they actually try and cram research into, you know, 3 weeks of Easter or 4 weeks of holidays in summer, and it's not too dissimilar, but I think it's compounded, and it is really problematic in that particular case in Hungary. So I think funding there is a real issue, but it also opens up possibilities for students to actually be involved in these small research projects. So there's a lot more. So when I was a student there, because I studied in Hungary, it was quite a striking, quite a striking experience as well, that I could do as a BA student, as an MA student, could actually do quite a lot of research projects, just because there was a tremendous amount of funding for small research projects that weren't staffed well, quite frankly. So I think the Hungarian case in that way is quite strange. The Norwegian case it's a better funded system. Obviously, it's a free, so there's no tuition fees. In a Hungarian case, there is certain state-funded places, and there is an issue with who actually gets funding and who doesn't, in terms of inequalities, and access problems aren't really talked about just yet. I think that sort of answers some of your questions.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've got lots of different papers to write, which is obviously the plan, right?
Yeah.
Sort of. Did you have another done with Meryem? You said you had some.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the question, and you disappeared for a sec.
Was there another part of the presentation that you're moving on to in terms of recommendations? Some work.
Yes. Yes. So if there's more questions on this work, I'm very happy to take those now. But otherwise, we will talk about the tips and suggestions for PhDs and kind of career planning.
Well, should we do that first, and then maybe we can then come back to that.
Let me reshare. Oh yeah. Sorry, I just cheated there. Some of the slides. So this is Asad's tips. Do you want to come and talk about them, Asad?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rita. So I have got some tips for those who are enrolled in PhD. So I can give some tips after PhD, but it's not a big career, as I'm very early in my research and the post-PhD career. So some of these things, I think, which I felt observed, and I think everybody who is doing PhD goes through all these things. People struggle a lot with writings, and they leave a lot of writing up to their writing year, which is called in UK basically, which is your final year when you have collected all the data and everything. So one of these things, and they struggle a lot to complete, and they become frustrated, they got depression and everything. So it's very important that students, those who are in PhD, they just start writing from the very early days of their PhDs. They can start writing from the very first year. They can make some rough drafts around some topics, around some sections. So writing is a very important, and it is very encouraged. It's not just my experience. I'm sure it's experience of most of us sitting here, that we should start writing in the very early days. We should be doing literature review. We should be writing something about the theoretical framework we are using. So there should be a writing, and then it will be very easy to chop between at the end. Another thing which is very important in social sciences, especially when we are dealing with the different theoretical frameworks, we are reading a lot of literature, using multiple theories in education and sociology of education, that we should, because PhD can be a very lonely process, a very individual study. So it is very important that we make and join some reading groups. If there exists some reading groups of the same interest with the people, with the professors who are doing this research, or with the PhDs who are working on the same theoretical frameworks, working on post-structuralism, working on the Foucault, Bourdieu, or any other theory particularly. So it's very important and encouraging, because we get a lot of insight as a early career students of PhD, researchers of PhD. It is very important that we get that insight. It has multiple benefits. It gives you company. It gives you multiple insights into the issues, and it keeps you very vibrant during your PhDs. So this is something that we started but it was disrupted due to the COVID, and we couldn't basically continue that because of the COVID. But it was very encouraging in the early days that we made some groups of people who were working around the same theoretical frameworks. So that's another thing that I wanted to share with those who are doing the PhDs and listening. As a student,
Asad, you're breaking up.
Is very important because
yeah, Asad,
sorry?
I think there's
Hello?
an issue with your connection.
Hear me?
Yeah, it's gone very patchy,
Hello?
so we've lost
Yes.
the last few bits of that.
Yeah, there might be.
Yeah, sorry, I think your connection's gone really patchy.
The first one. Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
it seems that you're back
I
now.
think, okay. So these are some of the things that everybody can read here. So writing is a very important thing. We should start writing in the early days and making or joining the clubs around the same interest. Either you are working on a qualitative research, you should form a group with those who are working on in the qualitative research. Or if you are working on the same theoretical framework or some theorist, so it's important that you find out who other in your school is working around those topics. It can be really helpful and encouraging, and it gives you a broader perspective to see that particular issue. The third thing which I want to wrap up it, because as you said, my voice was not clear. Looking after yourself, it's the most challenging thing, I think. Apart from writing, struggles with the theoretical framework, other academic issues, this personal issue can be really, really tough for the PhD students. I went through a lot of difficulties because of the COVID and other issues, working with the sensitive data and so on. So I suffered this mental breakdown, and I have seen people who have suffered this mental breakdown, and it becomes really hard to recover up. So it's very common if students are going through this, PhD researchers. The good thing is that try to look for the help. Talk to your supervisor, talk to people in your school, talk to the GP, and try to get the help. There's no shame in getting help and coming out of this mental burden. So these are some of the tips that I wanted to share with the PhD students who are working here, whether they are locally based or they are international students. Thank you. Over to you, Rita.
Thank you. It's really, really helpful to kind of share these experiences, because I think these are the key issues that we don't necessarily talk about throughout PhDs. And as you said, Asad, a PhD is a really, really solitary, lonely process, but you can find ways to make that more of a community effort. And this is one of the themes that I think is running through the things that we all kind of pointed out. So these are tips that Betul sent me a few days ago. She wanted to kind of convey that these are precisely the issues, I think, some of the ones that Asad just mentioned, around what you have to kind of take care of yourself and take care of your own well-being specifically. And she actually pointed out the peer support too, thinking about the kind of PhD and D communities, finding colleagues at writing retreats and training courses, finding research groups that you can join and contribute to. I think social science research shouldn't be as solitary as it very often is. I myself really, really enjoy the process of talking about my research and others' research in a lot more detail, and I think there's real value in writing and collaborating. So I think this is one thing that she pointed out as well. She also talked about in her tips how you should draw on the institutional provision in terms of both research methods, but also dissemination courses. So somewhere in Lancaster, either within the school, Department of Education, or within the kind of broader university setting, you will find, you know, courses that help you to learn how to make a good poster, how you can actually present your work in a research paper. And these are important things to learn throughout the PhD process, because it's quite tricky otherwise to come to it later on. She also recommended to disseminating your work in different formats, and I think she's done quite a bit of kind of conference talks and posters and journals and blogging. And she also talked about the being able to accept and getting ready for major corrections and rejections from, especially from paper submissions, just because it happens. And I do remember someone actually telling me this: the people who say they don't get papers rejected are the ones who don't actually submit papers in the first place. So I think those were the key points that Betul wanted to make, if she was here with us today. And I've got a few as well. Very similar kind of themes to all of this. I just as Asad said, start writing early. I would also think starting to think about your papers early, potential papers, because I think you owe it to yourself and you owe it to your research participants to publish your work. It's an important milestone in your life to get to PhD, but it's also a really important milestone to then disseminating that work more widely. So start thinking about what you could publish, discuss that with your supervisors, discuss that with your external. It's a really, really good way to start thinking what is beyond the PhD, how can I actually make this work count more broadly, how can I actually contribute to knowledge. I think academia is full of kind of unpaid work, and it is quite tricky. And there is some value in kind of organizing research communities that is unpaid very often. But, you know, you have to know where you're actually, what is the point where you have to ask for funding. And I think we need to be, as academics, we need to be quite conscious of not asking too much of people for free. But I also think thinking about your research and your career in general more holistically is a good idea. And that relates to kind of building networks and taking opportunities that I think are quite useful to bear in mind. So, you know, going to conferences, disseminating your work more widely, but also meeting those connections that then end up inviting you to a research seminar sometime later on in your life. You know, we met 8 years ago, I think, Richard, and here we are. So I think that sort of wider community that is outside of your institution, outside of your workplace, is quite key. The peer support from others, the information, the sort of potential for future collaboration, but also importantly, emotional support. Knowing that you're not alone in this, knowing that you've got a broader community who will understand when you say, this is hard. I think it's useful to try and find a mentor with a long-term and holistic view of support that you need, and kind of getting those tips beyond the kind of nitty-gritty of everyday PhD work. You know, how do we actually think about my career more broadly? What are the things that I still need to do that will help you get a job? And for that, I would suggest always try and build a visible profile of your work through publications, through blogging, through conferences, through having some form of social media presence if you want to. And this is, I think, all contextualized with the sort of what matters to you, what do you want people to take away from your work, what are the things that you want to disseminate, what are the things that you want to change in your research, how can you actually get there? It's important to think about how you will be measured, especially if you go down the academic route. It is a tricky question, and I don't want to go into this in too much detail because I'm quite critical of the agenda. But I think it's useful to know at least how potentially you are measured later on. I always point this out to all of my colleagues and PhD students. There is a huge, and this is what Betul referred to as well, there's a huge repository of institutional support structures, from student support, mental health support, to careers advice, to you know, how to make a great poster. There's a lot of work, a lot of courses that you could join that are research methods courses. Do use those. Those are there for you. It's important that you engage with those spaces. I always bring the example of careers advice, because I think sometimes we think that we can write a great CV just because we know what we've done. And I think a careers advisor will look at our CVs in a very, very different manner and suggest ways in which we can present ourselves and our career outputs or outputs generally in a much better, much more engaging manner. So I think those were the points from me, and I'll stop sharing. Do get in touch if you've got any questions, suggestions, please, please, please do get in touch. I always love when people actually message me afterwards. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks. That's actually really timely. I did a session on decolonizing academic life with our on-campus PhD researchers earlier this morning, and lots of the stuff that you were talking about has come up about thinking what you value, and also how many different things there are to be doing.
Yeah.
And that recognition that now more than ever, having a PhD by itself is insufficient. And it's interesting that the ESRC has now extended PhDs to 3.5 years minimum. I guess as recognition, so you get 3.5 years funded rather than 3.
All right.
Which is recognition of the fact that it's thesis plus that you need to have in order to be successful. Whether or not other funders, including our own universities, follow suit remains to be seen. But let's see. So again, the floor is open. I mean, we are a PhD, almost, not quite, but PhD, very dominant department in a sense. That's what we do. Yeah, Anne-Marie.
Thank you. I just found that list of really helpful tips from Asad and Betul and yourself, Rita, incredibly useful. Incredibly useful. I mean, they're all things in some respects that we know about, but actually just to hear them articulated and framed in different ways. Just to pick up on one or two of them, just for the students from our own programs that may be listening to the video recording, our reading group, which is facilitated by Rebecca Marston. I think one of the features that I particularly like, it's got a particular format, but a feature that I think's to be recommended with any reading group is that opportunity to be able to talk about words that that are not familiar, or ideas that we're not confident about, because actually a reading group should be a safe place where we can come and talk through and be respected by others. And I think in terms of the mental well-being, absolutely, and the services that people can and can't access, but that isolation that some people can find, so that coming together to be able to be with one another and just to talk about some of the highs and the lows. I facilitate a writing day myself, and the students themselves are a huge source of support and encouragement to one another as they go up and down in this roller coaster. And I'll just pop into the chat, something that we did as one of our little icebreakers a while ago was just to share the calendar. There's a monthly calendar for the Action for Happiness website, and each month there's a different sort of thing for the day, but they're all in a sense well-being related agendas. And I think last September we did Self-Care September, and each person chose a number and was randomly given their little item to take away and to sort of think through, and actually a lot of feedback on how useful that had been. So this month is Mindful March, and I share that for you for those in the chat. So yes, that's the Action for Happiness. And I think some really, really helpful suggestions. So thank you for those.
Yeah, again, thank you. So the floor is open. Reminder, switch your camera on and or put something in the chat. I mean, because we do have an online master's degree, but we essentially offer 5 PhD programs. And most of our PhD researchers are working full time.
Yeah.
So probably we have 30 traditional PhD researchers doing the kind of the 3 to 4 year project, and then we have 400 and something taking the structured programs, and most of them, nearly all of them, are working full time. And so, of course, the careers advice is kind of different because most of them are doing their PhDs and staying in that job, and in part doing that PhD to progress up. So they have a really strong sense of how academia works quite often, or how their fields work, but they don't have the research stuff to join in with that necessarily, and that's interesting. So it makes the teaching really interesting here, because you have people that have lots of experience but haven't necessarily been able to conceptualize how it functions.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, the higher education imagination. Yeah, any other thoughts from people on the floor? Why do we say the floor when it's electronic?
Who knows? That's a very good question. There's a note in the chat, Richard, from Phil about the notion of well-being coming a lot in the department's doctoral research-led interview series. So that's something that people may want to follow up with in terms of after this event. So yes. Yeah,
the PhD as a solo project is a curious one, isn't it? Given that so little of the work that you do after your PhD is actually that solitary. But it is and it isn't.
Perhaps a question to Rita and Asad as to whether you feel there is anything particular. So I would say the advice you gave and your top tips would apply to all PhD students. But do you think there's anything that you might want to share or observe with regard to different disciplines? So I was thinking of, perhaps some of the science disciplines where there's a very different sort of culture and induction into the process, because it's often a team-related type of work.
I wouldn't know, to be honest, because I haven't really looked at sciences. My work tends to be either at undergraduate level or in social sciences, sociology specifically. This is anecdotal. Yes, I think there is a question about different structures when you do join a team, a lab in sciences, but I think it's a very, very different approach to all of this. Interestingly, though, I think quite a few of the European countries do actually do that model for social sciences as well. So I do remember when I was thinking of where to do my PhD, I was thinking of Amsterdam specifically, and the Dutch way of doing PhDs is mostly you actually join a team, and then within a bigger research project you do your own little thing that is just your PhD, but you generally contribute to the wider team effort. And it's the same in Norway, actually. I decided that didn't fit with what I wanted to do, and this is why I ended up in the UK doing my own research idea, whether for the better or worse, to be honest. But I think I think it helps because you are rooted in a research team, but then it comes with its own dangers in terms of the structure. If it doesn't fit with you, then it's even harder to manage. To get out of that team is even more tricky than actually changing supervisors in the current context with how you were doing it. So I don't know which one I would favor if I could start again.
I guess it's about what seems right for the individual, but that's interesting to hear about that approach in other countries, because certainly from a discipline perspective, talking to I think it was a physicist earlier this week, and they were talking very much about actually, the students moving through their masters and then through their PhD are in a sense almost gaining that apprenticeship.
Yes.
And then what they're doing for their PhD is probably something quite different. I mean, he was talking about how it was almost taking a year to learn how to use the piece of equipment before he could actually start doing, the actual research that he was needing and wanting to do. So it's all sort of different sorts of induction into our respective communities.
To add on to that, to come back to sociology, what are the connections between your top tips and the research teaching nexus? Because in a way, they're they're connected, right?
Yes,
But
yeah,
at the
they are.
moment, the connections are, I guess, the threads that we might think we make ourselves. But are there ways that you can see the connections, particularly as you interviewed PhD researchers in sociology? Was there something, for example, different between them and bachelor's and master's, or PhD bachelor's, master's, not to hierarchically
I think
position
there's
them?
a huge difference between Hungary. Well, there was a huge difference actually in those three countries, because Norway PhD students are in reality staff. So they're doctoral researchers who are employed by the institution to do their research project as a doctorate. That means that they're very differently involved in the department. They are members of staff, so they go to staff meetings. It's a very different kind of approach to understanding their role, and they generally have a teaching role, you know, join other research projects beyond their PhD. So it's a very different setting and the routing within the institution. I think that's, we know from having done PhDs in England, I've done mine full time, and it's a very, you are treated as a student. And I think it is tricky, and I don't think it's right. So I've always considered colleagues who I worked with to be colleagues, and I think it's I don't think it's usual in a way. But then the Hungarian one is tricky in different ways, because PhDs are quite underfunded. The PhD stipend isn't enough for you to live off of. And whoever is doing it full time, they will have to take jobs outside. So that I think there is major funding issues around that. Therefore, a lot of people actually go over time, and they don't actually finish within the 3 years. So quite a lot of my friends who actually started earlier than me in like 2008-9 doing their PhDs finished quite a lot after me, and I finished mine in 3 years full time. So it's, you know, it's a very different kind of relationship, because you end up thinking about your PhD as a part-time project, despite the fact that you are meant to be full-time in the Hungarian case. So I think it is different systems, and it is very different results because of that.
Yeah, the idea of the distinction between PhD researcher and PhD student
Students, yeah.
is telling. But I remember talking to German PhD researchers where the scholarship to do the project is less common, and they're a scientific Mitarbeiter, employee, and but also the difficulty is that they get given so much work, they don't get to do their PhD project. There's also that one that balances out, but they are on full-time work with a pension, with all of that stuff. Yeah, we do spread ours quite thinly in many ways. Okay, if there are no more questions, I can draw things to a close. Phil, you're reappearing with intent?
Not with intent, just with civility, to do a real round of applause, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So to Rita and Asad, also to Betul in absentia, in I don't know what the Latin word is for, anyway, in maternia, or pending maternia. So thanks a million for coming and sharing that super interesting project, and also the tips for PhD researchers. Super timely and relevant to us as a department. So I'm also duty bound to say that when the next online seminar is taking place, it's on the 1st of May 2024, and Gwenda Mayot from Liverpool Business School at Liverpool John Moores will be talking about questioning the ideal of the good student. So Rita and Asad, again, thank you very much for sharing of the time and the project. It's been super interesting to learn more about
you very much for having us.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate
Thank
that
you.
you accommodated my request for rescheduling as well. Thank you very much for having us.
Right. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Brilliant. Thank you.